Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Charleston. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the year 1841, when Charleston's cobblestone streets echoed with carriage wheels and the harbour bustled with ships laden with cotton and rice, the illustrious Whitehall Plantation stood as a monument to wealth and prosperity. Located approximately 8 miles north of Charleston's bustling harbour near the winding Cooper River, the plantation was renowned throughout South Carolina for its impressive yields and the apparent refinement of its owners. The main house, a grand federal-style mansion with imposing white columns and sprawling verandas, overlooked acres of meticulously maintained gardens before giving way to vast fields where enslaved people toiled from dawn until dusk. What happened behind the pristine white walls of Whitehall would not come to light until decades later, when a collection of journals was discovered during renovations to an adjacent property in 1867. These writings, attributed to various individuals connected to the plantation, revealed a darkness that Charleston society had efficiently buried, a narrative of psychological torment, manipulation, and the complex, disturbing dynamics between the plantation mistresses and the women they enslaved. The journals detailed the calculated cruelty of Elizabeth Crane, the mistress of Whitehall Plantation, and her closest confidant, Ruth Spencer, the wife of a neighboring plantation owner. According to multiple sources from the time, including church records and local newspaper accounts, Elizabeth Crane was considered a paragon of Southern womanhood, charitable, genteel, and deeply involved in Charleston's Episcopal Church. Her husband, Jonathan Crane, was frequently away on business, leaving Elizabeth to manage household affairs. Ruth Spencer, similarly, enjoyed a reputation as a cultured and educated woman, often hosting literary gatherings attended by Charleston's elite. What the public record failed to capture, however, were the psychological methods these women employed in the domestic sphere, methods that created an atmosphere of sustained terror among the enslaved women who served in their households. The first indication that something was amiss came from a notation in the parish records of St. Michael's Church. In February of 1841, Reverend William Harper noted that Elizabeth Crane had requested special prayers for what she described as difficult circumstances with household management. This seemingly innocuous entry coincided with the arrival of a woman named Sarah at Whitehall Plantation. Based on plantation purchase records recovered from the Charleston County Archives, Sarah was 22 years old when she was brought to Whitehall, having been purchased from a plantation in Virginia that had fallen into financial difficulty. According to the recovered journals, Sarah possessed skills in needlework and household management that made her particularly valuable in the domestic sphere. One journal entry, believed to be written by a house servant named Mary, who had been at Whitehall since childhood, described the day of Sarah's arrival. "The new woman came today. Mistress Elizabeth examined her hands closely and seemed pleased. But there was something in her eyes when she looked at Sarah that made me tremble. The same look she had before Josephine was sent away." The reference to Josephine remained unexplained in the recovered documents until a county death record was located, indicating that a woman of that name had died under unclear circumstances at Whitehall in 1839. The official cause was listed as fever, but the journal entries suggested something far more troubling. Within weeks of Sarah's arrival, Elizabeth Crane began what appeared to be a deliberate campaign of psychological manipulation. According to the journals, she would frequently summon Sarah to her private chambers to perform intricate sewing work, only to inspect it with exaggerated scrutiny. Elizabeth would cut the stitches and demand the work be redone, often keeping Sarah working through the night by candlelight. These episodes were described in detail by Mary, who wrote, "Sarah's fingers are raw. Mistress makes her unpick and re-sew the same pieces, even when the work is perfect, especially when it is perfect." Ruth Spencer, who visited Whitehall several times each week, appeared to encourage and participate in these manipulations. The journals described how she and Elizabeth would speak about Sarah as if she were not present, commenting on her appearance, capabilities, and character in the most demeaning terms. This technique, treating a person as if they were invisible while simultaneously making them the subject of conversation, appeared to be a calculated method of psychological control. By April of 1841, the journals indicated that Sarah had begun to display signs of severe psychological distress. She would stand motionless for long periods, would sometimes fail to respond when addressed, and had developed a habit of apologizing continuously, even when she had committed no error. The deterioration of her mental state seemed to provide Elizabeth and Ruth with a perverse satisfaction. Mary's journal noted, "They look at each other and smile when Sarah starts to shake. They speak softly to each other behind their fans. Sometimes they laugh." What made this case particularly disturbing was the contrast between the public personas that Elizabeth and Ruth maintained and their private behavior. Both women were active in charitable works throughout Charleston. Elizabeth Crane chaired a committee that provided food and basic necessities to impoverished white families, while Ruth Spencer organized fundraising events for an orphanage on Trad Street. Their reputations remained impeccable within Charleston society, even as they engaged in what modern psychologists would classify as severe psychological abuse within their households. The dynamics of power at Whitehall extended beyond the relationship between the mistresses and those they enslaved. The journals suggested that Elizabeth's husband, Jonathan Crane, was aware of at least some aspects of his wife's behavior, but chose to ignore them. One entry noted, "Master came home early and saw Sarah's condition. He looked away and said nothing. Later, I heard him tell mistress to be more discreet." This complicity through silence appeared to be common among the men of the household and neighboring properties, creating an environment where such abuse could continue unchallenged. By summer of 1841, Sarah's mental state had deteriorated significantly. According to Mary's journal, she had stopped speaking entirely and would comply with commands in a mechanical fashion. Elizabeth and Ruth's response was to intensify their psychological torment. They began to use Sarah as what they called their living mannequin, forcing her to stand perfectly still for hours while they draped fabrics over her body, discussing dress designs as if she were an inanimate object. The most disturbing elements of the journal described how Elizabeth and Ruth would deliberately create situations where Sarah would be forced to choose between impossible options, such as selecting which of two identical objects was better, knowing that either choice would result in punishment. This form of psychological torture, designed to destroy a person's sense of agency and rationality, appeared to be a source of entertainment for the two women. In August of 1841, a new development occurred that would further complicate the already toxic dynamic at Whitehall. Jonathan Crane brought another enslaved woman to the plantation, a 28-year-old woman named Harriet, who had previously worked in a Charleston household. The reasons for this acquisition remained unclear from the available records, but the journal suggested that Elizabeth Crane was displeased with this addition to the household, viewing it as an intrusion on her domain. Harriet's arrival created a shift in the power dynamics at Whitehall. Unlike Sarah, who had been systematically broken down over months of psychological abuse, Harriet appeared to have a stronger sense of self-preservation. Mary's journal noted, "The new woman watches everything. She sees how mistress treats Sarah, but she keeps her face still. When mistress speaks to her, she answers just enough to avoid trouble, but never more than necessary. There is something in her eyes that mistress cannot touch." Elizabeth's response to this perceived resistance was to attempt to turn the enslaved women against each other. According to the journals, she began to show preferential treatment to Harriet, giving her less demanding tasks and occasionally praising her work, while continuing to berate and punish Sarah for identical results. This strategy, commonly employed by those seeking to maintain control over others, created an atmosphere of uncertainty and competition that served to reinforce the mistress's power. Yet the journal suggested that Elizabeth's manipulations did not have the desired effect. Instead of turning against Sarah, Harriet appeared to develop a sense of protectiveness toward the younger woman. The entries describe small acts of assistance, Harriet completing portions of Sarah's assigned work when Elizabeth was not present, or positioning herself to block Elizabeth's view when Sarah needed a moment to rest. These acts of solidarity, though necessarily subtle and limited, represented a form of resistance against the psychological warfare being waged within the household. Ruth Spencer, upon observing these dynamics, reportedly suggested a more direct approach. According to Mary's journal, during one of her visits in September of 1841, Ruth proposed separating the two women entirely, with Sarah being relegated to work in the laundry, a physically demanding position that would have further isolated her from any human connection. The entry recorded Elizabeth's response. Mistress smiled that smile that makes my blood cold and said, "No, I think not. I find it much more interesting to watch them together. One never knows what people will do when they think no one is looking." This comment revealed perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth and Ruth's behavior. They appeared to view the psychological suffering they inflicted as a form of entertainment or experimental observation. Their interest was not merely in exerting control, but in watching the human consequences of that control, studying the breakdown of one person and the resistance of another, as if they were observing specimens in a laboratory. As autumn approached, the journals documented a new phase in Elizabeth and Ruth's psychological manipulations. They began to stage what Mary described as performances, in which they would force Sarah and Harriet to enact scenarios for their entertainment. These performances often involved having the women repeat phrases or perform actions that undermined their dignity and sense of self. The specific nature of these performances was not detailed in the recovered journals, but their psychological impact was clear. Mary wrote, "Sarah shakes for hours after. 4. Harriet's face shows nothing, but I have seen her hands clenched so tight that her nails leave marks on her palms." In October of 1841, a visiting minister from Philadelphia stayed at Whitehall for several days. Reverend Thomas Wilson, according to church records, was in Charleston to discuss missionary work and was hosted by the Cranes as a courtesy to the Episcopal diocese. His presence temporarily altered the atmosphere of the household, as Elizabeth was forced to moderate her behavior toward the enslaved women in the presence of an outsider. The journals indicated that Harriet attempted to communicate something to Reverend Wilson during his stay, positioning herself where he would see the physical evidence of the conditions under which they lived. According to Mary's account, Harriet made sure he saw her hands while serving dinner. "They are raw from the lye soap Mistress makes us use now." The Reverend looked troubled and asked Mistress about the welfare of her servants. She smiled and said we were all devoted to Christian principles of hard work and obedience. The Reverend seemed satisfied, but later I saw Harriet trying to speak with him alone. Before she could, Ruth Spencer appeared and sent her away with a task that could not wait. After Reverend Wilson's departure, Elizabeth's treatment of both women intensified, particularly toward Harriet, whom she seemed to suspect of attempting to expose the realities of Whitehall. The punishment was psychological rather than physical. Elizabeth began a campaign of small, deliberate actions designed to make Harriet question her own perceptions and memory. Mary's journal described how Elizabeth would move objects that Harriet had placed according to instruction, then berate her for putting them in the wrong location. She would give contradictory orders, then claim she had said something entirely different. This technique, what modern psychologists would term gaslighting, was employed with calculated precision. Mistress told Harriet to prepare the blue guest room for visitors, Mary wrote, then screamed at her for not preparing the yellow room, swearing that were her exact instructions. When Harriet tried to speak, Mistress accused her of insolence. Later, I heard Mistress tell Ruth Spencer how amusing it was to watch the confusion in Harriet's eyes. By November, the psychological warfare had created an atmosphere of paralyzing fear within the household. The journals described how Sarah had become essentially catatonic, responding only to direct commands and otherwise remaining motionless, while Harriet maintained a facade of compliance while attempting to mitigate the worst effects of Elizabeth's manipulations, both for herself and for Sarah. The situation reached a critical point in late November, when Jonathan Crane announced that he would be traveling to Europe on business and would be absent from Whitehall for at least 6 months. His impending departure seemed to embolden Elizabeth, who, according to the journals, began to speak more openly about her intentions regarding Sarah and Harriet. Mary recorded a conversation she overheard between Elizabeth and Ruth. Mistress said, "When Jonathan is gone, we shall have complete freedom to conduct our little experiments. I'm particularly interested to see how long the proud one can maintain her composure when there is no possibility of outside interference." The reference to experiments appeared frequently in the later journal entries, suggesting that Elizabeth and Ruth viewed their psychological torment of the enslaved women as a pseudo-scientific endeavor. This perversion of rationality, using the language of enlightenment to justify cruelty, reflected a broader cultural phenomenon in antebellum America, where various scientific theories were employed to justify the institution of slavery and the dehumanization of enslaved people. Jonathan Crane departed for Europe in early December, leaving Elizabeth with effective control over all aspects of the plantation's domestic operations. According to the journals, Ruth Spencer began to stay at Whitehall for extended periods during this time, ostensibly to provide company for Elizabeth in her husband's absence. These extended visits corresponded with an intensification of the psychological abuse directed at Sarah and Harriet. The journals described a particular incident that occurred just before Christmas of 1841. Elizabeth and Ruth staged what Mary called a mock trial in the Plantation's library, where they accused Sarah of stealing a silver hairbrush. Despite the fact that Sarah had not spoken in months and showed no signs of understanding the proceedings, they went through the formalities of presenting evidence, which Mary believed they had fabricated, and rendering judgment. The punishment was not physical, but psychological. Sarah was made to stand in the corner of Elizabeth's bedroom through the night, holding the allegedly stolen hairbrush above her head. When her arms inevitably lowered from exhaustion, Elizabeth would ring a bell that she kept by her bedside, commanding her to raise them again. This continued throughout the night, with Elizabeth apparently waking periodically for the sole purpose of checking that Sarah remained in her assigned position. Harriet, meanwhile, was forced to witness this punishment, while being told repeatedly that she would be next if she showed any sign of disobedience or resistance. According to Mary's journal, Harriet maintained her composed exterior during this ordeal, but later, when she thought she was unobserved, showed signs of extreme distress. I found her in the linen closet, pressing her apron against her mouth to silence her sobs. When she saw me, she straightened immediately and wiped her face, asking if there was something I needed. Even in her moment of weakness, she tried to protect herself by pretending it had not happened. Christmas at Whitehall brought a temporary reprieve as the plantation hosted various members of Charleston society for a lavish dinner. Elizabeth and Ruth were forced to present their public personas, the charitable and refined ladies known to the community. The journals noted the stark contrast between their behavior in public and their private actions. Mistress spoke so sweetly to Reverend and Mrs. Taylor about her concern for the less fortunate. She placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder, as if with affection, as she told them how devoted her household was to her. Sarah stood like a statue. Only those of us who knew would see the terror in her eyes at Mistress's touch. The new year of 1842 brought a development that would alter the dynamics at Whitehall. According to Plantation records, Elizabeth's elderly aunt, Catherine Montgomery, came to stay at the plantation following the death of her husband. Catherine, who was described in contemporary accounts as a devout and principled woman, had spent most of her adult life in Philadelphia and held what were considered progressive views for the time. Catherine's presence created a new complexity in Elizabeth's carefully controlled environment. The journals suggested that she was observant and not easily deceived by her niece's performance of benevolence. Mary wrote, "The old lady watches everything. Today, she asked why Sarah never speaks, and Mistress said she was simple-minded from birth. Aunt Catherine looked at Mistress for a long time before saying that it was strange, as Sarah's eyes seemed quite intelligent to her." Elizabeth appeared to find her aunt's presence increasingly constraining. The psychological manipulations continued, but were conducted with more subtlety, and often when Catherine was resting in her room or otherwise occupied. Ruth Spencer visited less frequently during this period, apparently uncomfortable under Catherine's scrutinizing gaze. By February of 1842, according to the journals, Catherine had begun to intervene more directly in household matters. She requested that Sarah attend to her personally, removing her from Elizabeth's immediate control for significant portions of the day. While Catherine could not directly challenge her niece's authority over those she enslaved, the legal and social structures of the time prevented such interference. She appeared to be creating what limited protection she could within those constraints. The dynamic between Elizabeth and her aunt grew increasingly strained. Mary's journal recorded overhearing an argument between them in late February. Aunt Catherine said that she found the atmosphere of Whitehall oppressive and unlike what Christian charity should produce. Mistress replied that Aunt Catherine did not understand the particular challenges of managing a southern household. "These people are not like your northern servants," she said. "They require a firm hand." Aunt Catherine replied, "There is a difference between firmness and cruelty, Elizabeth, and I fear you have lost sight of it." This confrontation marked a turning point at Whitehall. Elizabeth, accustomed to exercising unchallenged psychological control within her domain, found herself facing resistance from a source she could not easily dismiss or manipulate. An elder family member whose social standing and financial independence provided a degree of immunity from Elizabeth's tactics. Catherine's presence also appeared to embolden Harriet, who began to communicate more directly with the older woman when circumstances permitted. The journals suggested that Harriet managed to convey some of the realities of life at Whitehall to Catherine without explicitly accusing Elizabeth, a dangerous action that could have resulted in severe consequences. In March of 1842, Catherine Montgomery fell ill with what was initially diagnosed as a severe cold. As her condition worsened, she requested that Harriet be assigned as her nurse, a request that Elizabeth reluctantly granted, likely to maintain appearances of familial devotion during her aunt's illness. This arrangement provided Harriet with both protection from Elizabeth's psychological torments and the opportunity to build a relationship with Catherine based on genuine care rather than coercion and fear. The journals described how Harriet attended to Catherine with remarkable diligence, staying by her bedside through the night and anticipating her needs before they were expressed. As Catherine's illness progressed to pneumonia, the doctor who attended her, Dr. James Wilson, according to medical records from the period, remarked on Harriet's exceptional care. According to Mary's journal, this praise further agitated Elizabeth, who resented any recognition of Harriet's capabilities that did not come from or through her. By April, Catherine's health had deteriorated to the point where her recovery seemed unlikely. The journals described how, during a period of lucidity, Catherine asked to speak privately with Dr. Wilson. After this conversation, Dr. Wilson's demeanor toward Elizabeth reportedly changed, becoming notably cooler and more formal. While the content of their discussion was not recorded in the recovered documents, subsequent events suggested that Catherine had shared her concerns about the treatment of the enslaved women at Whitehall. Catherine Montgomery died on April 18, 1842. In a surprising development revealed through probate records, her will included a specific provision regarding Harriet. Catherine had apparently used her own funds to purchase Harriet from Jonathan Crane's estate, as he was the legal owner, and had arranged for her manumission upon Catherine's death. The will also included funds for Harriet's relocation to Philadelphia, where Catherine had connections who would assist her in establishing a new life. This posthumous act of intervention created a legal situation that Elizabeth could not easily circumvent without risking public scrutiny and potential damage to her social standing. According to the journals, Elizabeth was furious but constrained by the legal documentation and the witnesses to the transaction, which included Dr. Wilson and a respected Charleston attorney named William Pinckney. Sarah, however, remained at Whitehall, with no similar protection extended to her. The journals described how, following Catherine's death and the arrangements for Harriet's departure, Elizabeth's psychological manipulation of Sarah intensified, as if in retaliation for what she perceived as Catherine's interference and Harriet's impending freedom. In a particularly disturbing entry from late April, Mary wrote, "Mistress has forbidden anyone to speak to Sarah at all. She has ordered that Sarah be treated as if she were invisible. When Sarah entered the dining room to serve this morning, Mistress looked through her as if she were not there. Ruth Spencer came for tea and did the same. They spoke about her as if she were an object that had been placed in the wrong position. That ugly vase would look better in the corner," Mistress said, staring directly at Sarah. "Yes, it disrupts the harmony of the room where it stands now," Ruth replied. Sarah began to tremble, but remained where she was, as she had received no command to move. The calculated cruelty of this treatment, denying Sarah's very existence as a person while simultaneously making her the object of discussion, represented a form of psychological torture designed to complete the destruction of her sense of self that had begun months earlier. Harriet was scheduled to depart for Philadelphia in early May. According to the journals, in the days leading up to her departure, she attempted to communicate with Sarah when possible, apparently trying to provide some form of comfort or connection before she left. These attempts were necessarily covert, as any observed interaction would have resulted in punishment for Sarah. The most detailed of these interactions was described in what would be the final entry of Mary's journal found among the recovered documents. She wrote, "Tonight I saw Harriet kneel beside Sarah's pallet after the house was dark. She whispered something I could not hear, then pressed something into Sarah's hand. Sarah did not respond or acknowledge her in any way. But after Harriet returned to her own sleeping place, I saw Sarah's hand close tightly around whatever she had been given. It was the first voluntary movement I had seen her make in months." The journal ended abruptly at this point. What happened in the days that followed, including whether Harriet successfully departed for Philadelphia as arranged in Catherine Montgomery's will, remained undocumented in the recovered materials. The fate of Sarah, after this point, also remained unclear from the primary sources. Plantation records indicated that she was still listed as property of Whitehall Plantation at the end of 1842, but no further specific mentions of her were found in the recovered journals or other documents. The story of Whitehall came to light in 1867 when the adjacent property, which had once belonged to Ruth Spencer, changed ownership. During renovations, workers discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of what had been Ruth's private study. This compartment contained the journals that detailed the events at Whitehall, along with several personal items believed to have belonged to Sarah, including a small handkerchief embroidered with initials that did not match any known member of either household. These discoveries were documented by the property's new owner, Thomas Bradford, who had moved to Charleston from Boston after the Civil War. According to an article published in the Charleston Daily News in August of 1867, Bradford turned the materials over to a local historical society. The article noted that Bradford had commented on the disturbing nature of the journals and suggested that they provided a window into the darker aspects of our recent past that many would prefer to forget. However, within weeks of this article's publication, a fire destroyed the Historical Society's archives. Official reports attributed the fire to a knocked-over lantern, but speculation persisted that it had been deliberately set to eliminate records that cast prominent Charleston families in an unfavorable light during the sensitive post-war period. Bradford himself left Charleston shortly after these events, returning to Boston, where, according to correspondence preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, he spoke of unsettling experiences during his time in the South. He never published or publicly discussed the specific contents of the materials he had discovered. The story of Whitehall Plantation, Elizabeth Crane, Ruth Spencer, and the women they tormented might have been lost to history entirely if not for a final, unexpected discovery. In 1927, during the renovation of an old church in Philadelphia, workers found a sealed metal box behind a loose brick in the basement wall. The box contained several letters, a journal, and legal documents, including manumission papers for a woman named Harriet. The journal, which appeared to have been written over several years beginning in 1842, detailed Harriet's escape from Charleston, her establishment of a new life in Philadelphia, and her efforts to document what she had witnessed at Whitehall Plantation. The final entry, dated 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, read, "Now that slavery has ended, I feel I must record the full truth of what happened at Whitehall, not for vengeance, but so that such darkness cannot hide behind silence. Sarah, wherever you may be, know that you are remembered." The fate of Sarah remained unknown. Harriet's journal suggested that she had attempted to locate Sarah after the war, but had been unsuccessful. Whether Sarah survived the remaining years at Whitehall under Elizabeth Crane's control, whether she was sold to another household, or whether she eventually found freedom through other means, the historical record remains silent. What survived were the documented methods of psychological control and manipulation employed by Elizabeth Crane and Ruth Spencer. Methods that relied not on physical violence, which would have been visible and potentially damaging to their social standing, but on the systematic destruction of their victims' sense of self, reality, and human dignity. The story of Whitehall Plantation serves as a reminder of the complex and often overlooked dimensions of cruelty that existed within the institution of slavery, dimensions that went beyond the physical brutality more commonly acknowledged in historical accounts. The psychological warfare waged in the domestic spaces of plantations like Whitehall represented a form of violence that left few visible scars but caused profound and lasting damage. Today, the site where Whitehall Plantation once stood is occupied by a residential development. No historical marker acknowledges the events that occurred there. The names Elizabeth Crane and Ruth Spencer appear in Charleston's historical records only in the context of their charitable works and social prominence. Their victims, Sarah, whose last name was never recorded in the recovered documents, and Harriet, whose full name appeared in the manumission papers as Harriet Johnson, remain largely invisible in the official history of Charleston. Yet through the fragmented journals, letters, and legal documents that survived attempts to erase them from history, their experiences provide testimony to both the calculated cruelty of those who held power and the resilience of those who endured, and, in Harriet's case, eventually documented what they had witnessed. Their story reminds us that history is often written not only by the victors, but by those with the social power to control the narrative, and that recovering the full truth requires looking beyond official records to the hidden testimonies of those who were meant to remain silent. In the words of Harriet Johnson, written in 1865, "The truth cannot stay buried forever. Eventually, it finds its way to the light." Researchers at the University of South Carolina, who later examined the recovered documents, suggested that the psychological methods employed at Whitehall were not isolated phenomena, but rather represented a refined version of control techniques used throughout the plantation system. What made the Whitehall case notable was the detailed documentation that survived, providing a rare window into the calculated nature of this psychological warfare. Dr. Eleanor Richards, a historian specializing in women's roles in the antebellum South, published an analysis of the Whitehall documents in 1958 that suggested Elizabeth Crane and Ruth Spencer's methods may have been influenced by broader cultural currents. During the 1830s and 40s, there was growing interest among certain segments of American society in what was then called moral treatment of mental illness, approaches that avoided physical restraint in favor of psychological conditioning. While these methods were ostensibly developed for therapeutic purposes in asylums, Dr. Richards proposed that Elizabeth and Ruth had perversely adapted these techniques as mechanisms of control and punishment. The Charleston Mercury archives from 1841 revealed that both Elizabeth Crane and Ruth Spencer had attended a series of lectures given by a visiting physician from Philadelphia on the topic of modern management of the nervous disposition. This connection suggested a disturbing appropriation of supposedly progressive medical ideas for the purpose of domination and psychological torture. Further evidence of the calculated nature of their methods emerged in 1933 when an antiquarian book dealer in Richmond, Virginia, acquired a leather-bound volume that had once belonged to Ruth Spencer's personal library. The book, published in 1837, was titled Observations on the Management of the Insane and contained numerous marginal notes in what handwriting experts later confirmed was Ruth's distinctive script. Many of these annotations appeared next to passages describing how to break down and rebuild a patient's sense of reality, with Ruth's notes specifically considering how these techniques might be applied in a domestic setting. This discovery suggested that the psychological torment inflicted at Whitehall was not merely intuitive cruelty, but represented a methodical application of contemporary psychological theories redirected toward maintaining control within the plantation household. The notes revealed Ruth Spencer's particular interest in what the text called the management of delusions, techniques for convincing patients that their perceptions were unreliable. One of her annotations read, "Most effective when applied consistently over time." Subject begins to question all perceptions, not merely those targeted. In 1869, 2 years after the discovery of the hidden journals at the former Spencer property, a former enslaved man named Joseph, who had worked as a groundskeeper at Whitehall, gave testimony to a northern journalist collecting accounts of plantation life. His recollections, published in The Atlantic Monthly under the title Voices from the Silent Years, included observations of the household dynamics at Whitehall from an outside perspective. Joseph described how Elizabeth Crane maintained a dual persona that was widely recognized among those she enslaved. Mistress Crane had two faces. The one she showed to visitors and to the pastor was all Christian charity and refinement. The other appeared when no outside eyes were watching. We all knew to be most careful when she was smiling in a certain way. The house people suffered worst. They walked as if on broken glass around her, especially after the quiet one came. The quiet one in Joseph's account was clearly identifiable as Sarah, though he did not know her by name, indicating the degree to which she had been isolated within the household. His testimony provided external confirmation of the patterns described in the recovered journals, particularly regarding Elizabeth's manipulation of her public image and the specific targeting of Sarah for psychological torture. Joseph's account also mentioned Ruth Spencer, whom he described as the shadow that followed Mistress Crane. Where one went, the other followed, and darkness traveled with them. This characterization aligned with the journal descriptions of Ruth as both accomplice and instigator in Elizabeth's psychological manipulations. Perhaps most significantly, Joseph's testimony included a detail not found in the recovered journals, a reference to what happened at Whitehall after Harriet's departure. According to Joseph, Elizabeth Crane's behavior became increasingly erratic in the months that followed. After the older woman died, the mistress's aunt, I believe, and one of the housewomen was sent away, something changed in Mistress Crane. She became careless. The mask she wore for company would slip, even when important folks from Charleston were visiting. People began to whisper. This observation suggested that the loss of both her principal target, Harriet, and the constraint represented by her aunt's presence had destabilized Elizabeth's carefully maintained dual persona. Without these counterbalances, the psychological methods she had refined over years began to affect her own presentation of self, allowing glimpses of her private cruelty to emerge in public settings. Joseph's account continued. By autumn of that year, visitors to Whitehall became less frequent. Ladies who once came regularly for tea found reasons to decline invitations. Mistress Spencer still came, but even she seemed concerned by what was happening. Once I overheard her telling Mistress Crane that she needed to be more careful, that people were talking. Mistress Crane laughed in a way that made Mrs. Spencer step back from her. This description of Elizabeth's increasing instability was corroborated by a letter discovered in the personal papers of Margaret Pinckney, a prominent Charleston socialite, which was preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society collection. Writing to her sister in Savannah in December of 1842, Pinckney remarked, "I must tell you of the most uncomfortable afternoon spent at Whitehall last week. Elizabeth Crane, whom I once considered the very model of genteel composure, interrupted her own sentence no less than 3 times to berate a serving girl for imagined offences. The poor creature, I believe she is simple-minded as she never speaks, trembled violently, but made no sound." Even more disturbing was Elizabeth's expression as she watched the girl's distress. I can only describe it as hunger. Ruth Spencer, who was present, seemed embarrassed by the display and attempted to redirect conversation, but Elizabeth was quite insensible to the discomfort she had created. "I shall not be returning to Whitehall if I can possibly avoid it." This social withdrawal would have represented a significant blow to Elizabeth's standing in Charleston society, where maintaining appearances and social connections was paramount. The fact that even Ruth Spencer, her closest confidant and accomplice in psychological torture, had begun to distance herself, suggested that Elizabeth's behavior had crossed a threshold that threatened their carefully constructed social facade. By early 1843, according to county medical records, Dr. James Wilson was making regular visits to Whitehall. While the specific nature of his treatment was not recorded, pharmacy ledgers indicated prescriptions for laudanum and other sedatives commonly used at the time for what was termed nervous excitement or feminine hysteria. These medications, which contained significant amounts of opium, would have been prescribed to Elizabeth rather than to those she enslaved, suggesting that her mental state had deteriorated to the point of requiring medical intervention. Jonathan Crane returned from Europe in March of 1843, cutting his business trip short by several weeks. Church records indicated that he consulted with Reverend William Harper shortly after his return, though the content of their discussion was not documented. Within a month of his arrival, two significant changes occurred at Whitehall. Ruth Spencer's visits ceased entirely, according to Joseph's testimony, and Sarah was no longer present in the household. What happened to Sarah remained one of the most disturbing unanswered questions in the Whitehall narrative. No record of her sale to another household was found in the county transaction records, nor was there any documentation of her death or escape. She simply vanished from the historical record, her fate unknown, a final act of erasure that reflected the broader pattern of silencing and invisibility imposed upon her throughout her time at Whitehall. Joseph's testimony offered only a cryptic reference to her disappearance. The quiet one was there one day, and gone the next. No one asked questions. Some things were better not to know in that house. This statement, with its ominous implication, aligned with a brief notation found in Dr. Wilson's personal daybook, preserved in the Medical University of South Carolina archives. The entry, dated April 12, 1843, read simply, "Called to Whitehall regarding female patient, too late to be of service, deeply troubled by circumstances. Consider duty to report." No further entries regarding Whitehall appeared in the daybook, and no official report was ever filed with authorities, suggesting that Dr. Wilson ultimately chose discretion over disclosure, as was common in cases involving prominent families. Elizabeth Crane's own fate followed a trajectory of progressive isolation and decline. By 1844, according to correspondence between Charleston families preserved in various archives, the Cranes had withdrawn almost entirely from society. Jonathan Crane focused increasingly on business interests that kept him away from Whitehall, while Elizabeth rarely left the plantation. A letter from Jonathan Crane to his business partner in 1845, found in the collection of the Charleston Historical Society, made brief reference to Elizabeth's condition. "Mrs. Crane's health continues to require careful management. Dr. Wilson visits weekly and has recommended quiet and seclusion as the best course. We have reduced the household staff considerably as she finds the presence of servants increasingly distressing. Ruth Spencer provides companionship occasionally, though these visits often leave Elizabeth in an agitated state that persists for days afterward." This description suggested that the psychological methods Elizabeth had employed against others had created patterns of thought and perception that ultimately consumed her own mental well-being. The reference to finding the presence of servants increasingly distressing particularly indicated a collapse of the power dynamic she had once controlled so meticulously. The final documented chapter of the Whitehall story came in 1849, when a fire destroyed the main house. According to newspaper accounts, the fire began in the middle of the night and spread rapidly. Jonathan Crane escaped with minor injuries, but Elizabeth perished in the blaze. The Charleston Courier's brief report noted that Mrs. Crane, who had been in delicate health for some years, was apparently unable to leave her bedchamber when the fire began. Investigations into the cause of the fire proved inconclusive. The official report cited possible carelessness with candles or lamps, but Joseph's testimony, given 20 years later, offered a different perspective. That fire didn't start by accident. Some said it was judgment. Others who knew more about what went on inside those walls stayed silent, but their eyes said enough. The implication of arson, possibly as an act of retribution by someone who had witnessed or experienced the abuses at Whitehall, remained speculative, but aligned with the pattern of buried truths and hidden resistance that characterized the entire Whitehall narrative. After the fire, Jonathan Crane left Charleston permanently, relocating to Baltimore, where he remarried and established new business interests. He never spoke publicly about the events at Whitehall or his late wife's behavior, maintaining the code of silence that had enabled the abuses in the first place. Ruth Spencer outlived both Elizabeth and Jonathan Crane, dying in 1872 at her Charleston home. Her obituary in the Charleston Daily News praised her contributions to various charitable causes and described her as a lady of refinement and Christian principle, with no mention of her role in the psychological torture documented in the recovered journals. This public whitewashing of her reputation represented a final success of the dual persona she and Elizabeth had cultivated: the ability to commit acts of calculated cruelty while maintaining an image of genteel benevolence. The broader significance of the Whitehall case lay in what it revealed about the psychological dimensions of power within the plantation household. While historical accounts of slavery often focused on the physical brutality of the system, particularly as it affected enslaved men working in fields, the Whitehall documents illuminated the equally devastating psychological warfare conducted in domestic spaces, primarily by women against women. This gendered aspect of control within the plantation system received little scholarly attention until the 1970s, when feminist historians began to examine the complex power dynamics between white women in slaveholding households and the enslaved women who served them. The Whitehall documents provided some of the most detailed primary source evidence of these dynamics, documenting specific psychological techniques employed to maintain control while avoiding the visible violence that might have damaged the perpetrator's social standing. Dr. Angela Thompson, writing in 1984, argued that cases like Whitehall represented a feminized version of the sadism inherent in the slave system, no less brutal for being psychological rather than physical, and perhaps more insidious for operating beneath the veneer of genteel domesticity. Her analysis highlighted how Elizabeth and Ruth's methods allowed them to exercise extreme cruelty while simultaneously performing the role of the refined Southern lady, a dual performance that both maintained their social position and gave them access to victims they could manipulate with relative impunity. The recovered documents from Whitehall also provided insight into forms of resistance that existed within these oppressive domestic environments. Harriet's strategic compliance, presenting a facade of obedience while maintaining an inner core of selfhood that Elizabeth could not touch, represented a sophisticated survival mechanism. Her small acts of assistance to Sarah, conducted at significant personal risk, demonstrated how solidarity could exist even within the most carefully controlled environments. Catherine Montgomery's intervention, limited though it was by the legal and social structures of the time, showed how even those who benefited from the system of slavery could recognize and attempt to mitigate its cruelties. Her posthumous arrangement for Harriet's manumission represented a form of resistance conducted through the very legal frameworks that enabled slavery, using her privilege to create a pathway to freedom that would otherwise have been inaccessible. Perhaps most significantly, the survival of the documents themselves, hidden beneath floorboards, sealed in walls, preserved despite attempts to destroy them, testified to an understanding among those who recorded these events that truth must be preserved, even when it could not be immediately acted upon. Harriet's final journal entry, with its assertion that the truth cannot stay buried forever, reflected an awareness that documentation itself was an act of resistance against the erasure that power often demands. The story of Whitehall Plantation has never entered mainstream historical narratives of Charleston or the Antebellum South. The plantation site bears no marker acknowledging what occurred there, and the names Elizabeth Crane and Ruth Spencer appear in local histories only in the context of their social standing and charitable works. This selective remembering, celebrating the public personas while burying the private realities, continues the pattern of erasure that the women themselves cultivated during their lifetimes. Yet through the fragmented documents that survived, Mary's journal, Harriet's testimony, Joseph's recollections, and the scattered official records that corroborated their accounts, the truth of Whitehall has persisted, offering a window into aspects of history that more official narratives have overlooked or actively suppressed. In 1996, during an archaeological survey of the former Whitehall property prior to new development, researchers from the University of South Carolina discovered a small item buried approximately 18 inches beneath what would have been the floor of the detached kitchen building. The object was a simple cloth doll, crudely made from scraps of fabric, with no facial features, but with a distinctive embroidered pattern on what would have been its chest. When cleaned and examined, the pattern was revealed to be a set of initials, S.H. No definitive connection could be established between this object and Sarah, the woman who disappeared from Whitehall in 1843. The initials did not match her first name with any known surname, as her last name was never recorded in the recovered documents. Lydia Montgomery, the archaeologist who led the survey, proposed in her report that the doll might represent a form of bearing witness, a marker intentionally left by someone who knew that Sarah's story would otherwise be erased from the historical record. The careful preservation of this humble object, she suggested, represented a determination that even if Sarah's fate remained unknown, her existence would be acknowledged. This final artifact from Whitehall, a simple doll hidden where it might be found by future generations, provided a fitting coda to a narrative characterized by deliberate erasure and persistent efforts to preserve truth against powerful forces of silencing. Yet the location of the object, hidden beneath a floorboard in an area where enslaved workers would have had some privacy from constant observation, and its deliberate burial suggested an act of commemoration or remembrance. Like the journals concealed beneath floorboards and the testimonies recorded decades after the events they described, the doll represented an insistence that those who suffered at Whitehall would not be entirely forgotten. The full truth of what happened within those walls will never be known. The gaps in the historical record, particularly regarding Sarah's ultimate fate, remain unfilled. Yet through the fragments that survived, we glimpse the complex realities of a system that enabled sophisticated psychological torture within genteel domestic spaces, the calculated cruelty of those who wielded power within that system, and the equally sophisticated resistance of those who endured it. In the absence of complete knowledge, the ethical obligation of historical memory becomes even more essential. To acknowledge what is known, to honor what was preserved against the forces of erasure, and to recognize the voices that insisted on recording truth even when justice seemed impossible. These acts of remembrance represent a belated but necessary response to the message Harriet Johnson left sealed in a Philadelphia church wall. The truth cannot stay buried forever. Eventually, it finds its way to the light. Today, the land where Whitehall Plantation once stood has been transformed into an upscale residential development. The marketing materials highlight the property's historic charm and traditional Southern architecture, with no mention of the psychological warfare once conducted within similar walls. This selective memory, prioritizing aesthetic appeal over historical reckoning, mirrors the broader cultural tendency to romanticize plantation life while minimizing its brutalities. Yet for those who have encountered the Whitehall documents, the historians who have studied them, the archivists who have preserved them, and now those who read this account, the obligation to remember remains. Not merely to acknowledge horror for its own sake, but to recognize how systems of oppression operate through both physical and psychological means, how power maintains itself through selective visibility and strategic erasure, and how resistance persists even in environments designed to crush human spirit. The story of Whitehall, preserved through hidden journals and buried artifacts, serves as a reminder that history's silences often speak as loudly as its documented narratives, if only we learn to listen for what has been deliberately left unsaid.